Thank you very much for such a warm welcome. I was trying to decide the other day whether I'd write out, sort of scribble down my thoughts, or whether I'd just sort of extemporise. And I've decided I'd put a few things down on paper, so if you'll forgive me, I'm going to do a bit of reading this evening. Now, I'm not a scholar, and I'm not really interested in textbook definitions of romanticism. For me, romanticism is a state of mind and the product of a particular sensibility which naturally attunes itself to those things that disturb and stimulate the imagination through their very uncertainty and ultimately their unattainability, I think. We have inherited this restless uncertainty, which had its modern beginnings as the religious dilemma in which society and its artists found themselves as a result of subject, feeling and structure, to quote Robert Rosenblum, starting to form and reform unconventional alliances. As this sense of uncertainty in society grew, the landscape and those in it began to feel a sense of loss. It was the loss of God's hand in the world and the disappearance of any reassuring conviction that a higher power oversaw all that could unfold that left the European mind increasingly alone in the cockpit. The 20th century Swedish poet Per Lagerkvist deals beautifully, if somewhat painfully, with this in one of his last collections of poems. The translation of these poems into English by W.H. Auden was the last really valuable thing that English poet thought that he'd done. I'll read you an extract. Who walked past the window of my childhood and breathed on it? Who walked past in the deep night of childhood that still was starless? With his finger he made a sign on the pane, on the moist pane, with the ball of his finger, and then he passed on to think of other things, leaving me deserted forever. How should I be able to interpret the sign in the moist afterwards of his breath? If it stayed there a while, perhaps, but not long enough. Not long enough for me to be able to interpret it. Forever and ever would not have sufficed to interpret it. When I got up in the morning, the window pane was clear, and I saw only the world such as it is. Everything in it seemed so strange to me, and behind the pane, my soul was filled with a loneliness and longing. Who walked past in the deep night of childhood, leaving me deserted forever? The inability to reconcile ourselves to a gathering sense of loss turned longing into a more powerful emotion than any other, and this is what charges the great works of the Romantic spirit, propelling us both forward and backward in time. But our relationship to all cultural artefacts of any age is now shot through the prism of Romanticism. Whether we look backward to Michelangelo's Academy slaves, are they emerging from the living rock or are they sinking back into it? And still further back in the sense of the relationship we have now to perhaps the Elgin marbles. Would these have the gravity and the poignancy for us today if they stood before us in mint condition? I doubt it. A primary quality of the Romantic consciousness centres on the fragmentation of that which was once whole. But without us ever having experienced, only imagined the pristine state of something, we are nonetheless faced with both an abstract legacy that stretches back to the Platonic dialogues and the desire and pursuit of the whole, and the physical embodiment of this loss, the eloquent silence of these remarkable fragments. Of course, this universal mythology of a golden age before the fall deepens and extends our sense of participation, of belonging, of being inside history and the flow of time, and simultaneously animates our sense of loss. I think all great art is essentially romantic. Forward now to the impossibly sweet mnemonics of Cy Twombly's Lost Arcadia. These impenetrable palimpsests carry the sheer weight of history as a form of loss. There is nothing more romantic in modern painting for me than these inaudible chants, because that is what they feel like to me. Standing in front of a Twombly painting, I find myself imagining that the sounds that echoed through the archaic Greek temples in Agrigento had in fact been absorbed into the surface of the walls and, if one listened very carefully, one might still hear the actual sounds made by the priests and musicians 2,500 years ago echoing inside the stone. They are still in there, is what I thought when I last stood in front of one of his paintings. The romantic mindset reinforces the contradictory, a sense of dislocation, this sense of the impossibility of ever being fully reintegrated into the world that once was whole, and yet at the same time, a feeling of deep connection to someone or something. When I'm up close to antique sculpture, I always feel as if there are secrets hidden inside the stone. And indeed there are. And when the face remains, it seems to me that the eyes are always looking inward, not out at the world. And these objects seem always to have looked inward, hermetically sealed against the everyday world and the passage of time. It's the silence. They offer us an incredible journey back into ourselves, back into the lost domain of our childhood, our unconscious, and when we really are swept off our feet, overtaken by one of these encounters, at an almost cellular level, or so it feels, we sense that otherness, strange yet familiar, primordial nature coursing through us. The poetry of Nobel laureate Seamus Heaney has a remarkable capacity to leap through time, a capacity that the romantic sensibility permits us. In a poem entitled Punishment from the 1970s, what starts out as a description of a Neolithic girl discovered in a peat bog suddenly turns into something else. He ceases to say she or her at a particular point, and with a breathtaking glance back into the depths of our collective consciousness, addresses her as you. And at the moment the poet begins to address the victim directly, the writing leaves behind archaeology and collapses into a love poem. Then lastly, as if to hook us all on some unseen barb, we're suddenly back in the 20th century and staring in a mirror. This is it. I can feel the tug of the halter at the nape of her neck, the wind on her naked front. It blows her nipples to amber beads. It shakes the frail rigging of her ribs. I can see her drowned body in the bog, the weighing stone, the floating rods and boughs, under which at first she was a barked sapling that is dug up, oak bone, brain firkin, her shaved head like a stubble of black corn, her blindfold a soiled bandage, her noose a ring to store the memories of love. Little adulteress, before they punished you, you were flaxen-haired, undernourished, and your tar-black face was beautiful. My poor scapegoat, I almost love you, but would have cast, I know, the stones of silence. I am the artful voyeur of your brain's exposed and darkened combs, your muscles webbing and all your numbered bones. I who have stood dumb when your betraying sisters, called in tar, wept by the railings. Who would connive in civilised rage, yet understand the exact and tribal, intimate revenge? Romanticism is indeed a state of mind where not just the power of our emotions, but remarkable intellectual journeys unfold. Another great writer whose leaps of faith, I almost want to say, provide us with spectacular and dramatic revelations of how we really live inside ourselves and of how uncertain the relationship of this interior world is to the world beyond our bodies is Elias Canetti. We never really escape this deep sense of uncertainty if we're sensitive to our interior world, when confronted with what we feel to be the reality of the situation before us. Things are not as they appear. In Canetti's daybooks, which he kept for many decades, there appear only a brief couple of entries on the momentous occasion of the 1969 Apollo moon landings. It's so disappointing about the moon, he wrote. Everything that we calculated, size, weight, distance from Earth, turns out to be correct. And what were they really doing up there anyway? Secrets deposited on the moon. I find the films, particularly the documentaries of Werner Herzog, tremendously romantic in the way that he is always trying to describe an impossible state of affairs, In Lessons in Darkness, his film about the Gulf War, he interviews people who are in shock and physically cannot speak. They stare mutely into the camera, some mumble incomprehensibly, move their hands around. Over and over he persists in conducting these interviews with people beyond speech. And there is great humanity in such an approach which refuses to accommodate the audience by leaving the incommunicable where it belongs, out of reach. This is a profoundly romantic sensibility at work. Indeed, as he films the burning oil wells in their desert, a pitch-black sky overhead, and Wagner, only Wagner, on the soundtrack, the visual beauty of the imagery overtakes you by surprise, creating a feeling that is profoundly disconcerting. I'd now like to read you a short story. Although it was written in 1913, it perfectly encapsulates this romantic state of mind, even as it simultaneously reflects in an almost postmodernist way upon itself. It's my favourite piece of short fiction, not least because of its exquisite articulation of the atmosphere of the sublime. An entirely parallel universe conjured from a mere page and a half of text by the great Robert Walser. It's called Balloon Journey. The three people, the captain, a gentleman and a young girl, climb into the basket. The anchoring cords are loosed and the strange house flies slowly, as if it had first to ponder something, upward. Bon voyage, shout the people gathered below, waving hats and handkerchiefs. It is 10 o'clock in the evening. The captain pulls a map from a case and asks the gentleman if you'd like to do the map reading. The map can be read. Comparisons made. Everything to be seen can be clearly seen. Everything has an almost brownish clarity. The beautiful moonlit night seems to gather the splendid balloon into invisible arms. Gently and quietly the roundish flying body ascends, and now, hardly so one might notice, subtle winds propel it northward. The map-reading gentleman tosses from time to time, as directed by the captain, a handful of ballast into the depth below. There are 5 sacks of sand on board, and they must be used sparingly. How beautiful it is, the round, pale, dark depth below. The moonlight, tender and evocative, picks the rivers out, silver. One can see houses down there, so small, like innocuous toys. The forests seem to be chanting sombre and ancient songs, but this chanting strikes one as being more like a noble, silent knowledge. The earth's image has the features of a huge sleeping man, at least that is what the youthful girl dreams. She lets her bewitching hand hang indolently over the rim of the basket. Obeying a whim, the cavalier is wearing a medieval plumed hat, but is otherwise dressed in a modern way. How quiet the earth is. One can see everything distinctly, the particular people in the village streets, the church spires, tired after a long day's work, labourers tramping across the farmyard, the ghostly railroad streaking by, and the dazzling light freeway. Human sorrow, familiar and unknown, seems to send murmurs up from below. The loneliness of remote regions has a special tone, such that one believes one ought to understand and even see this special thing that slips away from thought. Wondrously now, the three people are dazzled as they see in the glory of its colours the luminous course of the Elbe. The nocturnal river draws from the girl a low cry of longing. What might she be thinking of? From a posy she has brought along with her, she pulls a dark rose in full bloom and throws it into the sparkling water. How sadly her eyes shine as she does so. It is as if the young woman had just now forever shed a painful conflict. It is a very painful thing, having to part company with what torments you. And how mute the world is. Far off, the lights of a major town are glittering. The canny captain pronounces its name. Beautiful, enticing depth. Countless areas of field and forest are now behind them. It is midnight. Somewhere on the solid ground now a thief prowls, hunting for swag. There is a burglary. And all these people down there in their beds, this great sleep slept by millions. An entire earth is dreaming now, and the people rest from its labours. The girl smiles, and how warm it is, as if one was sitting in a room just like home with mother, aunt, sister, brother or with one's lover, lamplit, and reading from a beautiful but rather monotonous long story. The girl wants to sleep. Looking at things has made her quite tired now. The two men standing in the basket gaze silently but resolutely into the night. Remarkably white, polished-looking plateaus alternate with gardens and small wildernesses of bush. One peers down into regions where one's feet would never have trod, because in certain regions, indeed in most, one has no purpose whatever. How big and unknown to us the earth is, thinks the feather-headed gentleman. Yes, your own country does finally become intelligible to you from up here looking down. You feel how unexplored and powerful it is. 2 provinces they have now crossed, and the dawn is coming. Below in the villages, human life awakens. "What's the name of this village?" the leader shouts down. A boy's clear voice replies. And still, the 2 men are gazing. Now too, the girl is awake again. Colours appear and things become more distinct. One sees lakes inside their drawn contours, wondrously secluded among forests. One glimpses ruins of old bastions, towering up through old foliage. Hills rise almost imperceptibly. One sees swans trembling and pale on waters, and the human voices become pleasantly audible, and onward one flies, onward. And finally, the glorious sun appears, and, attracted by this proud star, the balloon soars upward into a magical, dizzying height. The girl shrieks with fear. The men laugh. My imaginary short, or perhaps incredibly long, film of this balloon journey might have as its soundtrack the soft noise of the wind, the zephyrs circling the balloon as they run their fingers through the hair of those on board. A picture. The wind brushing through the ancient olive groves in the Valley of Temples in Sicily, and now frozen in the undulating drapery and flowing hair of a marble statue in the British Museum. This image might provide us with an understanding of how to film these people drifting through the air on a summer's night in 1913. I think of it as a kind of millennial slippage. Or perhaps the soundtrack to this film could be drawn from the long, low goodbye that we experience in parts of Anton Bruckner's music. All of these unlikely and incongruous juxtapositions feel to me as if they make perfect sense. But then, I'm on my journey. Yours will be different. I think that we are now all naturally disposed toward this millennial slippage and the recognition that when others on their own journeys find a significant overlap with those around them, that it is indeed a fortunate accident. Romanticism emphasises the entirely unique and ultimately untranslatable nature of first-hand experience and, perhaps as an art historical movement, no matter how amorphous, highlights nature's resistance to all attempts to control and standardise our responses toward things. What is that noise? It's nature whispering in our ear, resist all wars against the individual. We should perhaps be looking more closely at the romantic sensibility in an age when everyone is pushed so hard into becoming a machine head. Some of you might remember those 2 figures that have come and gone in much of Western visual tradition. We don't even need to look to the East, for even in our late mechanised state, the contemplative life is the first thing we think of when we look at the history of their art. The Lohan, the aesthetic, and the hermit. In the West, the 2 archetypes, I'm speaking of the active life and the contemplative life, have given way to a very different worldview centred on the active alone. We now seem increasingly satisfied, or perhaps indeed increasingly dissatisfied, but at any rate preoccupied with activity and its little turbocharged mate, technology. I've come to think of it as sportin' science, and you can drive through. I want to suggest that it is we who have, perhaps through the acceleration of this technology and mass mechanisation, pushed ourselves just a little bit too far in the other direction. Just consider for a moment the nature of change and the way in which we view ourselves and the world around us. Up until the Industrial Revolution in the West, due to the extra-generational rates of change in technology, things occurred slowly enough for everyone who had ever lived on the planet to assume that stuff had pretty much been the same in the past as it was during their lifetime. But as things have sped up, People rode horses, in fact, now that I think of it. From time to time, we forget that people rode horses in the time of the ancient Egyptians, right up until the age of steam, and indeed mostly up until the beginning of the 20th century. But as things have sped up, we find that unlike the world that existed before the 19th century, where stasis was the norm and change the exception, we now view constant change as the norm and stasis as the exception to life. Can you imagine how profoundly different the world must have seemed then to how we view it now? So what is the first casualty of this constantly active state? Contemplation. The opportunity to reflect, the personal space in which to wonder. It's interesting to reflect upon the evolution of public sentiment too in its relationship to nature. Before the later 1700s, those who lived in northern Europe and wanted to travel south to what was seen as the Garden of Italy had first to overcome the mountain of all the world's trash which God had heaped up as some kind of monstrous obstacle course before they could arrive in the classical landscape of the Mediterranean, what the Romantics would define as the glorious and sublime Alps less than a century later. Sometimes I think that in a reflection of the global rise in fundamentalism, all types, country and Western, we could be seeing a return to that pre-romantic take on the landscape and nature in general. And, for example, when I see the loss of, say, trees, big trees throughout the urban environment, because of the curious tyranny of an ever-increasing zealous occupational health and safety bureaucracy, I see the loss of beauty as just as much a health risk as the danger posed by a falling branch or a bumpy footpath. Is this a romantic reaction? Perhaps. But in any case, I think art's little mate science is beginning to back me up. Where the essential characteristics of romanticism become really interesting for us in our scientific world is, I think, when we are confronted with evidence and statistics. Statistics are a little bit like three-dimensional chess, different perspectives appearing to give very different information. Think of those moon quotes of Canetti's. It's very hard, with so little contemplation going on, to nail down, let alone justify, a culture of aesthetics as being essential to the handy modern life. If it's practical and it works, what more could be gained from fiddling with the appearance of something? But of course, as we know, appearances are important. Clearly, beauty, that which we might define as natural and balanced, is good for us. Put people in an ugly environment and they become ugly, antisocial, alienated, sickened. What I'm getting at is just how much the tyranny of the merely useful has undermined our ability to tap into the spiritual dimension of our surroundings. Now, some years ago, my crazy Swiss publisher, Walter Keller, brought out a book by an artist who'd spent years making delicate, finely drawn and watercoloured illustrations in the manner of the great flora and fauna artists of the 17th and 18th centuries. But these illustrations were of the rapidly increasing asymmetry of the many insects, butterflies, moths and beetles that lived within a certain radius of the by then shut down Chernobyl nuclear reactor. The book was called Heterotopia. Culture, of course, is never outside nature, despite the arrogance of some theoreticians. These theoreticians always run aground when trying to prescribe the ways in which the arts may be permitted to operate as an acceptable part of an organised society. I'm always reminded of Theodore Adorno's book Art and Society. Art's very use lies in its uselessness. Now, just how wrong can a fallen Marxist be? Where notions of the romantic have such an important role to play for us is in how sensibility, highly strung and sensitive to its environment, can alert us to the unlikeliness of so much around us, and hopefully through this shock of recognition put us back in touch with the truths of our own lives. It is in what we call the arts, cultural artefacts, that we find the one thing that seems to appear to be increasingly both a useless byproduct of society and yet also the most effective avenue for the communication of the most civilising of influences within our society, a sensitivity toward that which surrounds us. Yes, we all live in a new world, and the new world, in the form of a composer, Arnold Schoenberg, said of the last great farewell to the old world in the form of Gustav Mahler, his music was a paradise of ambiguity, Perhaps an inadvertent compliment on Schoenberg's part, but one which showed just how intoxicating the idea of living in modern times had become. The deep strangeness of our interior lives should never be forfeited for a government handout and a plasma TV. It is critical that we retain the capacity to be sensitive to ambiguity, because without it we lose the ability to draw inspiration and, yes, even guidance from the great artworks of the past. The most fundamental understanding we can ever have of the ancient Egyptians or the ancient Chinese comes from contemplating their artworks, the objects they left behind. To be sensitive to the past as a means of moving forward represents for me the essence of the romantic sensibility. Do we feel that something is becoming ours or that we are losing something? It's funny, but that question always makes me think of Bruckner. As we draw closer to a painting by Watteau, the surface disintegrates, breaking up into fragments that in the end we can no longer identify as specifics, but only as light flickering, and eventually, for the longer the fade out, the sweeter the pain, dying away. Is it moving toward us or away from us? Is that a wave hello or a wave goodbye? Thank you.